The Mesolithic period, 10,000 BC. Mesolithic Europe, brought to you by Genos Historia. The Mesolithic period. Now, obviously, not all of you know what the Mesolithic period is, so I'll tell you what it is. So it was a period of the Stone Age, which occurred from 13,000 BC until 6,000 BC, which means that it occurred from 15,000 to 8,000 years ago. So it was a really long time ago. And this is a grave in France which dates to the Mesolithic. In the grave are the skeletons of the two women who were buried in it. And what's cool about this is that you can see that there are necklaces attached to these women's skeletons. These necklaces have been attached to their skeletons since the Mesolithic for thousands of years. That's pretty incredible. And there are hundreds of Mesolithic graves like this that have been excavated all over Europe, hundreds. And DNA, that's right, DNA, because this channel is all about DNA, has been sequenced from about 180 of these Mesolithic graves, including this Mesolithic grave in France. Ancient DNA, or DNA has been sequenced from both of those women's skeletons and from the skeletons in 180 other Mesolithic graves. And because of this, we've learned several really interesting things about the genetics of Mesolithic Europeans. And right off the bat, at the beginning of this video, I'll tell you 3 different really interesting things that we've learned. So the first thing I'll tell you is that we've learned what skin color they probably had. Obviously, skin does not preserve for thousands of years. All that we have left from Mesolithic people are their skeletons. But looking at their DNA, we can get a pretty good idea of what skin color they would have had when they were alive. And looking at the DNA of Mesolithic Europeans, it appears that skin color in Mesolithic Europe varied from brown to white. So basically what I mean is that some people in Mesolithic Europe seem to have had brown skin color, some seem to have had light brown skin color, and some seem to have had white skin color like what most people in Europe today have. So for example, those 2 Mesolithic women from France that I've been showing you, their DNA suggests that they probably had brown skin color when they were alive, like this, like I'm showing you in this cartoon. However, this Mesolithic man, this is his skull right here, he lived in Scandinavia, and looking at his DNA, we can see that he definitely had white skin color, and also he probably had blonde hair color, like what many people in Scandinavia today. So it kind of tells a different story than those Mesolithic women from France did. Basically, complexion in Mesolithic Europe varied a lot. Overall, on average, darker than it is today, than modern Europeans are, but many of them had a complexion just as light as any modern-day Europeans do. A second interesting thing that we have learned about the genetics of Mesolithic Europeans is what Y haplogroups they belong to. Y haplogroups, of course, as most of you should know, are the haplogroup that is passed down paternally from father to son. So the Y haplogroups that existed in Mesolithic Europe are haplogroup I1, haplogroup I2, haplogroup R1A, haplogroup R1B1, haplogroup Q1, and haplogroup C1A. And what's interesting about this is that most of these haplogroups are still really common today. For example, haplogroup R1B1, tens upon tens of millions of people today still belong to haplogroup R1B1, including me and including many of you, and including this Mesolithic dude right here. He lived in Serbia during the Mesolithic, and his DNA shows that he belonged to haplogroup R1B1. However, some of the Y haplogroups that existed in Mesolithic Europe are extinct. They don't exist anymore, which isn't a surprise, you know. With the passing of time, some bloodlines go extinct. So some of the haplogroups, Y haplogroups that existed in the Mesolithic don't exist anymore, but most of them are still common today. And a third really interesting thing we've learned about the genetics of Mesolithic Europeans is how much DNA they have contributed to modern-day Europeans. There is no ethnic group in Europe today that traces 100% of their ancestry to people who lived on the continent during the Mesolithic. And this is because, as is widely known, after the Mesolithic, new people from Asia migrated into Europe, specifically from the Anatolian Peninsula, what is today Turkey. And these people are known as the Anatolian farmers. They came into Europe after the Mesolithic. All modern-day Europeans have some ancestry from them. But of course, all modern-day Europeans also have ancestry from people who lived in Europe during the Mesolithic. And in fact, there's many ethnic groups in Europe today who trace over 50% of their ancestry to Mesolithic Europeans, so a majority. If I were to go into further detail about each one of those three things, that would take me around 1 hour, which is too long. So in this video, I'm not going to do that. I'm only going to describe in detail to you one thing that we know about the genetics of Mesolithic Europeans. And this one thing is not any of those three things that I just mentioned. This one thing that I'm going to discuss in this video is who their ancestors were. When we discuss Mesolithic people and just ancient people in general, the focus is on how they are ancestors of modern people. But you know, they also had ancestors, just like how your grandparents also had grandparents. Mesolithic people did not pop up out of nowhere. They descended from people who lived even longer ago than they did during the Upper Paleolithic period. That's right, the Upper Paleolithic. This was the period that preceded the Mesolithic. It occurred from 50,000 BC until 13,000 BC. And then in 13,000 BC, it was succeeded by the Mesolithic. This video is a video about Mesolithic Europe, but I'm going to be mostly talking about Upper Paleolithic people, specifically the Upper Paleolithic ancestors of Mesolithic Europeans. So, Mesolithic Europeans descended from three different groups who lived during the Upper Paleolithic, and these three groups are Epigravettian, Magdalenian, and the ancient North Eurasians.
Epigravettian. Magdalenian. The ancient North Eurasians.
Epigravettian, Magdalenian, and the ancient North Eurasians. Those are the three Upper Paleolithic groups who contributed DNA to Mesolithic people who lived in Europe. So now you know their names, but you don't yet know where in the world they lived. So I will now show you where they lived on this map. So first, let's look at where Epigravettian and Magdalenian lived. All right, so they both lived in Europe. However, they lived in different areas of Europe. This area colored in red, that is where Magdalenian lived during the Upper Paleolithic. And this area colored in blue, that is where Epigravettian lived during the Upper Paleolithic. So as you can see, generally speaking, Magdalenian lived in Western Europe, and generally speaking, Epigravettian lived in Southern Europe. And I say generally speaking because technically part of where Epigravettian lived is actually in Western Europe, and part of where Magdalenian lived is actually in Southern Europe. So these are just Southern Europe and Western Europe are just general terms for describing where they lived. But you don't have to go off of those general terms. You can see on this map specifically the areas that they lived in. Anyways, they both lived towards the very end of the Upper Paleolithic, right before the Mesolithic. So saying that Mesolithic people who lived in Europe descended from them is really the same thing as saying Mesolithic people who lived in Europe descended from people who lived in Europe right before the Mesolithic, right before them. Surprise, surprise, surprise. That's not a surprise at all. Obviously, that is what is expected. However, there is a detail to this that is a surprise and which we could not have learned without ancient DNA. We could have predicted without ancient DNA that Mesolithic Europeans descended from people who lived at the very end of the Upper Paleolithic. That's not hard to predict. But something that we needed ancient DNA to figure out is that it's not that Mesolithic Europeans just generally descended largely from people who lived in Europe at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. It's that they specifically overwhelmingly descended from one specific population who lived in Upper Paleolithic Europe, and this is Epigravettian. Mesolithic Europeans as a whole overwhelmingly more so descended from Epigravettian than from Magdalenian. And this includes Mesolithic people who lived where Magdalenian lived, in Western Europe. So like, for example, Mesolithic people in Germany and France much, much, much more descended from Epigravettian, not from Magdalenian, even though Magdalenian lived in Germany and France and other areas of Western Europe. Despite that, the Mesolithic people who lived there did not largely descend from Magdalenian. Now, let's look at where the ancient North Eurasians lived. They were the third Upper Paleolithic group who contributed DNA to Mesolithic Europeans. So they did not live in Europe, they lived in Asia, specifically in Siberia, the frozen north. You have to think they probably developed very effective strategies for surviving in the harsh climate of Siberia during the Upper Paleolithic. The ancient North Eurasians migrated into Europe towards the end of the Upper Paleolithic period, sometime around 20,000 BC. And when they migrated into Europe, they would have run into the Epigravettian people and intermixed with them. An important thing to know about the ancient North Eurasians is they are the source of Y haplogroups R1a and R1b, which were common during the Mesolithic and are the most common Y haplogroups in Europe today. So they are still an important part of the ancestry of Europeans today. Now, an important thing to understand in this video is that all Mesolithic Europeans did not descend from the same Upper Paleolithic ancestors. This video is about the Upper Paleolithic ancestors of Mesolithic Europeans, but in no way am I saying in this video that all regions and all people who lived in Europe during the Mesolithic descended from the same Upper Paleolithic ancestors. People who lived in different regions descended from different ancestors. For example, I'll give you an example so you understand. Mesolithic people who lived in what is today Spain, they largely descended from Magdalenian. That was an Upper Paleolithic group that they largely descended from. But Mesolithic people who lived in what is today England did not descend from Magdalenian at all. And therefore, Mesolithic people who lived in these two different regions of Europe did not descend from the same Upper Paleolithic ancestors. People in different regions descended from different Upper Paleolithic ancestors. When I say that Mesolithic Europe descended from 3 different Upper Paleolithic ancestors, I don't mean that every single region in Europe descended from each one of those 3 Upper Paleolithic groups. Some regions descended from Magdalenian, while other regions did not. I just gave you an example where that's the case. Some regions in Europe during the Mesolithic descended from the ancient North Eurasians, while others did not. Now, all regions did, at least in part, descend from Epigravettian. There was only one Upper Paleolithic group that all Mesolithic people in Europe, at least in part, descended from. That's a very important takeaway in this video. All regions in Europe did not share 3 Upper Paleolithic ancestors in common. They only shared one Upper Paleolithic ancestor in common, and this was Epigravettian. And remember, Epigravettian is a nickname for people who lived in Southern Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, generally speaking, Southern Europe. I like to put things in geographic terms like that because the name Epigravettian is vague and it doesn't really tell you exactly who they were. They were just simply people who lived in Southern Europe during the Upper Paleolithic, and they are the only quote-unquote group, Upper Paleolithic group, that all regions of Europe later during the Mesolithic had ancestry from. Anyways, none of what I've just said should come as a surprise to you guys because Europe is a huge region, and we should expect people in different areas of it to have different ancestry. This is the case today, and this was the case during the Mesolithic. I just gave an example of how Mesolithic people in England and Mesolithic people in Spain had different ancestry, and we all know that this is also the case today. Modern people in Spain and modern people in England aren't exactly the same. They don't have the exact same ancestry. But by the way, the differences between Mesolithic people in Spain and Mesolithic people in England were not the same differences that exist today. The differences that exist today developed in later periods of history. So the next thing I'm going to do in this video is show you exactly what regional variation in Europe during the Mesolithic was like. And like I said, it was not the same type of regional variation that exists in Europe today. The regional variation that exists in Europe today developed because of events that occurred after the Mesolithic. But anyways, the way I'm going to do this is by showing you which regions descended from Magdalenian during the Mesolithic and exactly how much Magdalenian ancestry they had, which regions descended from the ancient North Eurasians and exactly how much ancient North Eurasian ancestry they had, and which regions, well, not which regions because all regions had Epigravettian ancestry during the Mesolithic, but I'm going to be showing you how different regions had different amounts of Epigravettian ancestry. And I'm going to do this with pie charts on this map. Each one of those pie charts represents the ancestry of Mesolithic people in whatever region that pie chart is in. First, let's look at exactly how much DNA Epigravettian contributed to Mesolithic Europe. Epigravettian ancestry, or you can say DNA, is represented by the color blue in the pie charts. However much blue is in those pie charts is how much Epigravettian ancestry that area of Europe had during the Mesolithic. The first thing to note when looking at this map is that every single pie chart has at least some blue in it. This is because every area of Europe had at least some Epigravettian ancestry. And the reason why Epigravettian ancestry existed in every single area of Europe is because Epigravettian people migrated to every single area of Europe. During the Upper Paleolithic, like I explained, they only lived in the southern and eastern areas of Europe. And at the onset of the Mesolithic, what happened is that they expanded out of this area and spread to every single area of Europe, spreading their DNA everywhere. But of course, percentages of Epigravettian ancestry varied across different areas of Europe during the Mesolithic. Some areas had more than others. So now let's look at that. The general rule was that the further west a population lived, the more Epigravettian ancestry they had, and the further east they lived, the less Epigravettian ancestry they had. So Epigravettian ancestry peaked during the Mesolithic in Western Europe, where people had between 100 and 88% Epigravettian ancestry. That's right, 100%. Lots of areas of Western Europe during the Mesolithic were 100% Epigravettian, even though Epigravettian people did not originate in Western Europe. It's because they migrated to Western Europe that Mesolithic people in Western Europe, some of them were 100% Epigravettian. One exception, however, was the Iberian Peninsula. Mesolithic people there were only 50% Epigravettian, which is pitiful compared to the 100% in some other areas. The reason why Epigravettian DNA was lower in Iberia was because of the influence of Magdalenian DNA there. So, which I'll talk about in a few moments. I won't talk about now, but which I'll talk about in a few moments. As you move east of Germany into Central and Eastern Europe, Epigravettian ancestry decreased due to the influence of ancient North Eurasian ancestry from Siberia in Central and Eastern Europe. So in Serbia, the Mesolithic people had about 80% Epigravettian DNA. And then further east in Romania, it decreased to 65%. And then further east in Ukraine, Epigravettian DNA decreased to 40%. And then even further east in Russia, it decreased to 30%. During the Mesolithic, Epigravettian ancestry was also lower in Scandinavia than in Western Europe, also due to the influence of ancient North Eurasian DNA from Siberia. So in southern Scandinavia, Mesolithic people had about 65% Epigravettian DNA, and in northern Scandinavia, they had about 50% Epigravettian DNA. Okay, now let's look at the amounts of Magdalenian ancestry in Mesolithic Europe. It's represented by the color green in those pie charts, and as you can see, man, it was not widespread. It only existed in Iberia and in southern France. It didn't exist in any other areas of Europe during the Mesolithic. Iberia during the Mesolithic had 50% Magdalenian-derived ancestry, and southern France had about 15%. And all other areas of Europe had no Magdalenian ancestry at all, 0%. So what's going on here? What happened to Magdalenian DNA during the Mesolithic? Why did it disappear from most areas of Western Europe? As I explained earlier in the video, during the Upper Paleolithic, Magdalenian people lived across most of Western Europe. They lived in Iberia, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands. But why is it that the Mesolithic people in most of those areas had no Magdalenian-derived ancestry? What happened to the Magdalenian people? Well, what happened is sad. They, for the most part, got replaced by Epigravettian people. So remember, like I said a few seconds ago, at the onset of the Mesolithic, Epigravettian people from southern and eastern Europe exploded and spread across Europe. And as they were moving in Western Europe, they mostly displaced the Magdalenian people who had been living there. We don't yet have enough ancient DNA to know the details of exactly what was going on between Epigravettian and Magdalenian people, but this encounter definitely did happen, and Epigravettian people definitely did, one way or another, mostly replace Magdalenian people. It's sad, it's kind of messed up, but extreme examples of population replacement like this do happen sometimes. And lastly, let's look at the amounts of ancient North Eurasian ancestry from Siberia in Mesolithic Europe. So it's represented by the color red in the pie charts, and as you could see, it was really widespread. Technically speaking, most areas of Europe during the Mesolithic had ancient North Eurasian ancestry. And this is an important takeaway I want you to take from this video, because in DNA papers, geneticists give the impression that during the Mesolithic, ancient North Eurasian ancestry only existed in Russia in what they call Eastern hunter-gatherers, but this is not the case. It existed in most areas of Europe during the Mesolithic. The only areas where it did not exist were areas west of Germany, which, granted, is a big area. So there was a big area of Europe during the Mesolithic that did not have ancient North Eurasian ancestry, but most areas did. The general rule was that the further east a Mesolithic population lived, the more ancient North Eurasian ancestry they had, which of course is what is expected because they entered Europe from an eastward direction. It peaked in Russia and Ukraine, where Mesolithic people varied from 60 to 70% ancient North Eurasian. So Mesolithic people in Russia and Ukraine were mostly derived from Upper Paleolithic people from Siberia. West of Ukraine, it then gradually decreased. In Romania, Mesolithic people were about 35%, and then west of there in Serbia, they were about 20%, and then all the way west in Germany, Mesolithic people were only 12% ancient North Eurasian. So, I mean, Mesolithic people in Germany had ancient North Eurasian ancestry, but only 12%, which really isn't a lot. And then west of Germany, Mesolithic people had no ancient North Eurasian ancestry at all, 0%. Now, I did not mention Scandinavia. During the Mesolithic, Scandinavia had high levels of ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Northern Scandinavia during the Mesolithic had 50%, and then southern Scandinavia had less at about 35%. This appears at first to not make sense geographically because Scandinavia is technically in the western half of Europe, but it does make sense geographically because there's a big chunk of land that connects Scandinavia to Russia, and this would have given ancient North Eurasians coming from Siberia a convenient route into Scandinavia. And also they're called the ancient North Eurasians, and Scandinavia is in northern Europe. So they were coming into Europe also from the north. And so, yeah, that would have given them a convenient route into Scandinavia as well. So that's another takeaway I want you to take from this video. Mesolithic Scandinavians, like Mesolithic Eastern Europeans, had high levels of ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Generally speaking, variation in Mesolithic Europe was a Eastern versus Western thing. And you can pick that out from the pie charts that I've shown you, because the further east a Mesolithic population lived, the more ancient North Eurasian ancestry they had, and the further west they lived, the more Epigravettian ancestry that they had. Most areas of Europe during the Mesolithic had both Epigravettian and ancient North Eurasian DNA. It's just that the further east they lived, the more ancient North Eurasian they had, and the further west, the more Epigravettian they had. So it's like a Western versus Eastern thing. But it wasn't totally a Western versus Eastern thing. It just mostly was. And the reason why is because Scandinavia during the Mesolithic also had lots of ancient North Eurasian ancestry. And Scandinavia isn't really in Eastern Europe. So saying that variation was a Western versus Eastern thing is kind of a simplification. I guess a more accurate way to say it is that it was an East and North versus West thing. But even this is too simplistic because it doesn't include Iberia. Mesolithic people in Iberia didn't totally fit into the ancient North Eurasian versus Epigravettian thing because they had lots of Magdalenian ancestry, while pretty much no other parts of Europe during the Mesolithic did. So during the Mesolithic, Iberia was kind of in its distinct category outside of the variation that existed in the rest of Europe during the Mesolithic. But I mean, overall, the variation in Mesolithic Europe was mostly a West versus East thing, but it wasn't exactly. It was a little bit more complicated than that. Today in Europe, variation is mostly a northern versus southern thing. That's widely known for anyone who studies the genetics of modern day people. And this is because of stuff that happened in the period after the Mesolithic in the Neolithic period. Specifically, the expansions of Anatolian farmers across Europe during the early part of the Neolithic in around 6000 BC, and the expansions of steppe pastoralists across Europe during the end of the Neolithic in around 3000 BC. Those two events are what created the northern versus southern variation that exists in Europe today. But during the Mesolithic, variation was a Western versus Eastern thing. Most people who study ancient DNA view this variation in Mesolithic Europe in a more simplistic way than I do. The way that most people view it is that Mesolithic Europe was inhabited by two races, the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, and that there was this clear border basically where the western border of modern day Russia is, that separated the western and eastern hunter gatherers, and they were like these two very different races with a clear border that separated them. And everyone west of Russia was a member of the western hunter gatherer race, and everyone in Russia was a member of the eastern hunter gatherer race. And what distinguished the eastern hunter gatherers in Russia from everybody else in Europe during the Mesolithic was that they had lots of ancient North Eurasian ancestry from Siberia. You guys who study ancient DNA are familiar with this view of Mesolithic Europe. And you're probably surprised that this is the first time in this video that I've spoken the words Western hunter-gatherer and Eastern hunter-gatherer. You probably expected this video to basically be me explaining what Eastern and Western hunter-gatherers were and what their origins were, etc. The reason why I haven't used those terms in this video is because this view of Mesolithic Europe is a simplification of what Mesolithic Europe was. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just a simplification that leaves out details. And in this video, I wanted to not give you a simplistic view of Mesolithic Europe, I wanted to give you a detailed and accurate view of it. This view, this Eastern hunter-gatherer versus Western hunter-gatherer view is not totally wrong, and I'm not saying that you should never use those terms. It's not totally wrong because it's true that variation in Mesolithic Europe was a Western versus Eastern thing, but the reality is this variation was mainly gradual and clinal. There wasn't a sharp border around where the western border of modern-day Russia is that separated Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers. There was a gradual change in Mesolithic people as you move in a westward direction, eastward direction. They gradually had more ancient North Eurasian ancestry as you moved east, and gradually had more Epigravettian ancestry as you moved west. There wasn't like a sharp border. And the same is true in Europe today. There isn't a distinct boundary that separates northern and southern populations. There's a gradual climb where it's like the further north you go, the more steppe ancestry modern people have, and the further south you go, gradually the more Anatolian farmer ancestry they have. But there isn't like a distinct line separating northern and southern populations in Europe today. And there wasn't a distinct border that separated Eastern and Western populations in Europe during the Mesolithic. That's all for this video. If you liked this video and found it fascinating, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.